One of the questions we opened up online and on the internet is, before we were going to interview yourself, was what would you do with the Equality Act? Because surely you believe British jobs for British people, so surely there would need to be like a discrimination in this law, so it would not be equal. What would you do with it?
We'd scrap it because it's not the business of a government to tell anybody, including employers, who they can associate with, who they can employ and all the rest of it. Employers should be free to take whoever they want, who they think is best for the job, and people who run clubs, pubs or whatever should be entitled to let in who they want and keep out who they want. And the moment you've got a state which says that it has the right to interfere in people's lives to that degree, then you may at one stage like what it's doing. You've got to understand that it's a state which now has so much power that if it decides to change its direction, it's got enormous power to do wrong. So the Equality Act is an example, a classic example of a nanny state gone mad. It needs axing because the money needs to be left in the pockets of the taxpayers.
Right, I'm not sure, a lot of people don't think you're actually understanding the Equality Act, because it's a way of moving forward, you know, the Equality Act, to make sure every individual is given the same right, and you know, even in America, the Bill of Rights, you know, every country is trying to make every citizen feel welcome, because it's very dangerous for making citizens feel not welcome, and they could turn to extreme views. And I think one of your policies is to combat extreme views. So don't you think discriminating would...
I'm completely against discrimination, and the problem is that what we've got is massive state-sanctioned discrimination against the indigenous people of Britain, and the other is making people concerned, worried. It's making huge numbers of middle-class people leave the country to go to Spain, and it's making working-class people who can't leave very, very angry, increasingly dissatisfied from and disconnected from the political process, but still worried about the problems. And that's a big risk. And we've had now 40 years of brutal discrimination against the white working class, so that white working class boys are absolutely the bottom of the heap in their educational attainment, that you have all sorts of government agencies using taxpayers' money to advertise jobs to ethnic minorities only. I think that's wrong. It's vicious against the indigenous majority. It's also bad for the members of ethnic minorities who get there under their own steam because they're the right man or woman for the job, because people look and say, oh, he, she only got that job because they're black. Because many people do only get the job because they're black or Asian or whatever, and the people who don't get even a chance at many of those jobs because they're discriminated against are the British people.
Nick, that's why it claims,
no, you know, fact. The Equalities Act and all that legislation, it's directed, well, basically they write off a big section of the population as white, and then they say that a section of the population defined only in that way doesn't have any protection.
If we go back to the Equality Act makes sure there is no discrimination. It's about for people getting in, not because of their colour, but because it's equal. No one's going to discriminate against each other.
It's about that for everyone except the British, except the indigenous white majority. And particularly against the English. Yet the English, we're not even allowed to classify ourselves on all sorts of forms. We're an invisible people. We pay the taxes. Our ancestors fundamentally built the country, but we are an invisible and oppressed people in our own country.
But technically, all ethnic minorities, you can argue, was actually originated in Africa. So everyone from Africa came spread out. So we can't really, you know, use that as such.
Of course we can. I'll tell you why. If you were interviewing, if you were talking about Australia, you wouldn't for 1 minute say that the Australian Aborigines, they're just another group of people living in Australia and they should have no special benefits whatsoever because they're exactly the same as the Europeans who've been there for only 200 years. You wouldn't dare say that because it's fundamentally racist, because the Aborigines are the first people of Australia and they have certain special extra rights. And we, my people, are the first people of the British Isles and of Europe.
Okay, let's talk about the two policies we talked about. One of them was that you said that a lot of British people are moving abroad because of jobs and because they're getting maybe fed up with people, a lot of immigrants coming into the country. But then it's a widely regarded fact that was done in 2011, 10 and 2009 that a lot of people, mostly middle class, who do leave the country, can afford to leave the country, 98% in a survey of 4,000 people said they leave it because for retirement, not because there's less jobs or they feel dissatisfied with Britain.
The majority of those would say, you're right, it's not about jobs, primarily that. Some young people are going abroad with for jobs, but there again, most parts of the world, there's not many jobs. So most people leaving the country are early retired, people have made it themselves. And I know, because I speak to hundreds of them, that if every year, that the key reasons they're going are the weather, which is obviously beyond anyone's control. But they're again getting sunburned in Spain all the time, soon wears off as a pleasure. The other thing is taxation, and the other thing is they just don't feel at home in Britain anymore. Because the Britain that, even I am 52, the Britain I remember growing up in is utterly different to the Britain we have now.
Nick, globalization. This is globalization, Nick, the freedom to maneuver.
Globalization.
We're half in the Eurozone, and free trade between going to different countries.
Yeah, I know
Don't
why
you think
it's
is benefiting Britain? Is actually one of the things that are benefiting Britain doing this. So having your policies in place would, you could say, isolate Britain. People would move out of Britain. The British identity in the international relations would be very isolated.
Well, let's look first of all at the question. You were saying globalisation, implying it's a force of nature. It's like gravity. You have your mobile phone, you let go of it, it falls to the floor. Globalisation is not like gravity. It's a set of political decisions made by a political elite because bankers and corporations have paid the bastards to do it. That's what it is, for a start. So globalisation didn't have to go through, and it can be held up or reversed. Now, I agree that there's a point to which going to other countries and seeing other countries and exchanging recipes and so on and things like this and seeing other people's cultures, it's part of what makes human life interesting and it's worthwhile. But what we are in Britain isn't a matter of a few people coming in and bringing some strange cultures and different recipes. My capital city, the city I was born in, I'm about to become a minority in that city. That isn't a bit of manageable immigration, that is colonisation on a vast scale, and it's destroying the identity of this country. On the world as a whole, this is a problem that all humanity has to get to grips with. That at present, there's about, according to ethnographers, there's about 5,000 different cultures, languages, different ways of feeling you belong and being human in the world. By the end of this century, there's going to be about 800 left, because they're being wiped out by the forces of globalisation. Now, if that was happening to every other species, everyone would say this is terrible, because it's a wipeout of diversity. Human diversity is being destroyed by globalism and big business and capitalism, and to say that isn't to hate other people, it's just to say that diversity is something which needs to be nurtured and cherished. It's a very delicate flower.
Isn't it the Western's fault? The West is the one that's globalising. It is the Western country, including the UK, being one of the top 8 richest countries that are actually globalising.
It's the West's elite's fault, yeah, sure. But don't expect the working class of Britain to pay the penalty for what a greedy elite is doing, because they were screwing the working class of Britain long before they were screwing anywhere else in the world. Okay,
let's move on to sort of like endpoint. Why cannot different coloured people, different ethnic minorities, such as in other countries? You see, for example, Australia, or you see, for example, like even India, for example, where there's a lot of Westerners going into each other's countries, but let's concentrate on Britain. Why can we not get on with each other?
Well, let's look at other countries, because when you make a decision, you have to think, what's the likely effect of this going to be long term? And a good way of judging that is looking at history. So let's look at the places in the world where there's mayhem and chaos, places like, or have been recently, places like Kosovo, places like large parts of Central Africa, places like Pakistan, places where there's terrible clashes between different people, even places like Northern Ireland. The more different people you try and put into a small area, the lesson of history is the more chance there is of terrible conflict and bloodshed between them. And since there's very, very few examples of a peaceful multicultural society, I think that having imposed that on Britain, without, and again, this isn't a problem. It's not the fault of the immigrants.
Nick, I have to hurry up here because
it's the fault of the elite who did it. They imposed totally undemocratically, without any by your leave from the public. They imposed a fantasy system, a utopia on Britain. We're going to turn it into a multiracial utopia. I think that was a terrible error. But I'm here to give British people who agree with me a chance to express their opinions in the ballot box.
Okay, so now very quickly, can you tell us why do you think the BNP is better than Conservatives and Labour, in short summary?
The British National Party is better than the other parties because, I would say, for ordinary people in Britain, because we would run the economy and run the country on the interests of Britain as a whole and the people within it, instead of a narrow sectarian group in terms of the corporations and big business and the banks. So I think that if I was a banker, I wouldn't vote BNP. because we're going to stop them looting Britain and make sure that Britain's money is used for the benefit of Britain. If I was an ordinary person, I'd think that's what I want.
Okay, let's move on to today's affairs. The Eurozone. As we know, there's a big crisis going on in the Eurozone, and how is it affecting Britain, first of all, and what do you think are the steps for Britain to do now?
Europe as a whole, it's difficult really you can't necessarily extract the Eurozone from Europe. They're so closely entangled. Europe as a whole is very bad for Britain. It costs us a huge amount of money, millions of pounds every day in direct payments, which could be spent on things we need at home like hospital beds and more police on the streets. And it costs us vast amounts of money in the red tape that's imposed on British businesses. So it's gradually strangling Britain. And we should be out of it, and we should keep our money and regain our freedom and our sovereignty and run our own affairs. Trade with Europe where it suits us and suits them, just as, say, Norway does, a very wealthy country, just as Switzerland does. You can work very closely with Europe. You don't have to be ruled by Europe. That's the first thing. As regards the Eurozone crisis specifically, obviously we're not in it, but it's affecting Britain. I think the latest figure is the crisis is now costing every British family £7,500. In lost income, and it's going to get far, far worse. It's inextricably linked with a global banking crisis, because we've got a rotten banking system which has looted the world for generations and is in a way a separate issue, but they're connected. What I would say is that we're in the early stages of a complete unravelling of globalisation. Globalisation was based on cheap energy fueling eternal growth. Cheap energy's gone. Eternal growth is now a fantasy.
What should Britain do?
Britain should do what every country is just going to have to do, and is going to do anyway, but the sooner we set about it, the easier it'll be, which is to work as far as possible to grow our own food, to make things in our own factories which aren't there to be made for a couple of years and then they're thrown away, because that makes maximum profit.
You believe that we should get out of the Eurozone?
We should leave, well, we're not in the Eurozone, we should leave Europe.
Europe, yeah.
Yep. And take back control of our own affairs, and then we should set about rebuilding a manufacturing economy which is primarily designed to serve a home market, instead of engaging in this horrendous around the world beggar thy neighbour trade, sending goods which can be made in could be made in Britain, we get them from China, we send goods all over the world. It's wasteful, it's destructive for the environment, and it can't carry on.
Right. Thank you very much for joining us here in the European Parliament. It's been good for the Q&A questions, and we hope to meet up with you soon and discuss more issues on the Eurozone.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Cheers.